At the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Oliver Scheuregger, who is the Senior Technology Engineer at Bang Olufsen. Oliver, welcome onto our podcast.
Thank you very much.
So we got to know each other, I think we were just saying about 15 months ago. And this all got started after Oliver Cadle, who is a sound designer and mixing engineer at, was it 1.618, which is an audio reference, I'm guessing, right?
No, it's actually the golden ratio.
Oh, it's the golden ratio, indeed. So 1.618 digital, and he'd come for dinner, and essentially, I think we got chatting afterwards, and he really felt that there was so much more that could be done with audio as part of our dining experience. And we got chatting about both, the audio tracks and the kind of sound engineering and design work that he does, but also about, the speakers and the setup and the layout of, the audio system that we had in place. And he mentioned that he knew someone at Bang Olufsen and went away. And then it was probably about a few weeks or a month later that I heard back from him. And that was kind of the route that paved the way for, where we are today, which is, I guess I'm excited to kind of say that now Bang & Olufsen and Kitchen Theory have partnered up, and we have this wonderful audio system installed in our studio. And really, Oliver, you're one of the kind of main architects of this project. So why? What got you interested? What got you thinking that having high-end audio equipment in a dining experience was a good idea?
Well, it was rather easy the way Oliver from 1618 explained it. He sort of gave me this brief introduction around what Kitchen Theory do, and I actually wasn't familiar with them, but I of course had some inkling as to the concept of this sort of multi-sensory dining experience. And I have quite some background with sort of 3D audio systems, both kind of on the research and development side. So I kind of knew what they could do from an artistic point of view. And I know also how much more it can bring if you have both good quality speakers, but also speakers placed in the right positions around the listening area. What sort of difference in auditory sensation that can deliver to people, and also in return how that can elevate other aspects of sense. So in this case with culinary, with tasting, and immediately my mind sort of started racing, thinking, okay, this makes perfect sense. It's actually have all those technologies ready to go. That is what we do. We create very high quality speakers in the first place, but also systems that allow you to connect those speakers up into kind of multi-channel surround sound systems. And they also look, I think, rather nice.
Oh, they look incredible.
So for me, it was kind of a no-brainer when Oliver explains the concept, and I essentially said, well, we have to talk with Joseph as soon as possible and see, what are the details behind this? What's the timeline? What do you expect when it comes to content creation? And I think that's another topic we can maybe talk into a little bit later on, is the content creation side of things as well is really key here, because it's not simply technology that does this, right? The technology is an enabler. You need to have good quality speakers. You need to have systems that can, receive audio and distribute them across an array of loudspeakers, for example. But at the same time, you need good quality content that can kind of capitalize on that setup as well. And it's the combination of those two things that, when they come together, can produce something fantastic. And when I saw this kind of trio where we had your Kitchen Theory chef's table, we had Oliver, who I knew from a previous job, working in audio content creation, and I had myself, who could represent Bang & Olufsen and bring the technology to the table, as it were. It was a total no-brainer.
And I guess one of the things that we quite early on found that we had in common was kind of an interest in sensory experiences, right? And not looking at, let's say dining or listening to music as being something that are kind of completely separate activities, but something that could be brought together, that kind of audio aspect, how that could heighten the dining experience, and how that dining experience could also kind of, mesh into this kind of audio experience that you're having. And I guess also what's interesting kind of in that element is your interest in research. And so at Kitchen Theory, we're very, much into multidisciplinary projects. And I guess the work that we've done with Professor Spence over the last 12 years, really looking at the sensory aspects of dining and looking at the importance of sensory inputs, and sound being a really, really important one. I mean, Professor Spence references sound in many ways, talking about sonic seasoning, talking about sound as being the forgotten flavor sense. And what intrigued me was when I saw on your profile that you've actually written papers, looking at kind of the world of audio. And one that stood out to me was where you talk about kind of 3D audio systems. And it brought up this idea and the difference between, you touched on this just a moment ago, between having great speakers and the way that you lay those out within a space. And so I think a lot of people, when they're thinking of good quality sound, they're thinking about maybe the quality of the actual recording as well as the output. But how important is the actual layout? Because when we were designing the experience here, that seemed to actually be quite a big chunk of time was taken up in terms of, right, where are these speakers positioned?
So the history of, let's say, multi-channel stereo loudspeaker setups, is rather interesting, and I'd say outside the scope of just this chat alone. But broadly speaking, we started off with mono, with one speaker in space, and then it turned into two speakers, and that difference just with one speaker was enormous in the sense that it could create.
When did that technology come about, out of interest?
So commercially around the 50s, it was
Okay.
stereo loudspeaker systems were brought into consumers' homes around the 50s, and with some difficulty because of the technological requirements, getting people to place things in the correct position, getting people to sit in the correct position became a real challenge, and was it required more kind of let's say input from the user than just a mono system where you just plonk a speaker down, you can listen to something. But what it could bring if you do those things, if you as a consumer sit in the right place, you set things up more or less correctly, the difference in experience is extraordinary from mono to stereo, in the sense that you can now actually recreate the sense that things are left and right. You can create a sense of depth, which typically isn't so easy when you just have a single mono speaker. And then, of course, over the following decades, more and more systems were experimented with. Some failed drastically, like quadraphony, for example, where you have now four speakers, one sort of left, right in the front and left, right in the back. And perhaps the reason for failure is also a bit outside the scope of this talk, but some of the reasons could just be that it's just difficult to bring it to the consumers' homes and get all the setup done correctly. Partly possibly because the difference in experience between what we have today of stereo and the quadraphony wasn't large enough to sort of warrant the right setup.
Okay.
Now, if we kind of fast forward to the 2000s, there are so many different layouts that people are looking into, from 5.1, most people are aware of due to its use in cinema and home cinema systems as well. Then you have 7.1. So for those who don't know, the sort of the first number represents the number of speakers on the horizontal layer. 5 means you have 5, 3 in the front, 2 in the back. 7, you add 2 extra in the back. The .1 refers to this sort of low frequency effects channels, basically all the subwoofer stuff.
Right.
And then what's quite interesting, then people started adding speakers above, because sound comes from everywhere in the real world, and the goal of these loudspeaker reproduction systems is to attempt to reproduce the sound field as if you're in a certain location. And sometimes those systems are trying to do that in a very physically correct way, that actually to properly reproduce that sound field that would have impinged on your ears had you been in that location. Or it can also be quite artistic, that you're trying to create a kind of an atmosphere of a certain acoustic location. But nonetheless, all they're trying to do is reproduce an effect acoustically in a way that's very authentic. So adding height channels kind of makes sense, because sound in the real world comes from above you as well. So then we have these systems like 5.1.4. So it's like 5.1 with 4 above you. 7.1.4 is the same thing. You even have 22.2, where you even have a lower layer, horizontal layer, and and a height layer as well that was developed.
And so what could you create having that kind of a setup that you otherwise wouldn't be able to?
Yeah, I mean, if you extend that to infinity, imagine you had infinite number of speakers around you. You essentially now have the ability to perfectly recreate a sound field anywhere that would have occurred in the real world. So you can kind of make a recording and then perfectly reconstruct that at another time and location.
And that then creates a super immersive experience, right? Like that's almost like hyper realistic audio experience.
Yeah, you could argue, that all loudspeaker reproduction systems are attempts to trick your brain into believing that you are in a certain acoustic location.
Yeah.
And the poorer that illusion, the more your brain is aware that it is an illusion. And of course, in theory, the more speakers you have, the better you can trick the brain into thinking it's somewhere else. But of course, as with anything, there's a sort of a ceiling that you hit at some point. So it's not just the more speakers you have, the better it is. It's not just the higher quality speakers you have, the better it is. There is actually kind of a trade-off. And that's actually what part of the thing that the research you mentioned earlier, we were looking into at my previous role at Fraunhofer in Germany, was perceptually evaluating people's responses to these sort of higher order systems like 22.2 versus 714, 514, 7.1s, 5.1 down to stereo. And actually what you see is there is a huge increase in sort of the perception of attributes like immersion, for example, or localization, how well you can actually localize sounds around you. But at some point, it does kind of tailor off. It does plateau.
Right.
It's not just more and more speakers will be better. It's more complicated than that, of course, because a big part of what you perceive through these complex systems is also denoted or contingent on the audio content that goes into them.
Right.
So it's kind of the technology is only as good as what you give it. So there is this very interesting kind of duality or this dependence on the artistic side and the technology. And I've personally focused more on the technology side of things, just trying to evaluate objectively how these systems perform. And it's very, very clear, at least, that you need, if you want to reproduce something that's very authentic, and I think also for kitchen theory, what you're trying to achieve, having sound come from above you, in addition to sound coming more from the horizontal layer, this will really unlock something special for diners.
Well, that's it, because I guess a big part of what we talk about with our experience is transporting people and immersion into an experience. And, when you're trying to take people to let's say, the deep, dark forest and serve a dish that has a narrative related to the great outdoors, being able to recreate a more authentic kind of 3D audio environment. Again, as you said, it's that kind of idea of tricking the brain, right? As in, if you smell the aroma of geosmin, that kind of damp earth smell, if you have the projections of the forest floor, and then you have this kind of immersive audio experience, all that is priming your brain, making more salient in it those sensations that you would have in that environment. And that's what we talk about when we say kind of we want to immerse people into an experience. And I just think that audio is such a great way of adding that rich sensory layer to that experience.
I think it's often overlooked. We see that in the sort of film world, that if you look at the budget given to the sounds versus the video, it's quite significantly different. Of course, there are also just technological reasons for that. It's more expensive to own some of this video equipment and so on. But it also, I think, reflects a little bit how we as consumers perceive these, different sensory components. Video, what you see dominates over what you hear. But that's actually, I have no doubts that it's true in many, many situations, but that shouldn't mean that we should overlook the benefits that sound can bring, especially when it can deliver something that is very, very authentic in terms of delivering these sort of spatial cues from not just in front and left and right that we're quite used to, but also coming from above and behind, and doing this in a way that is kind of not interactive, but in a way that is authentic, delivering sound in a way that we perceive it in the natural world. And that's what some of these more sort of sophisticated surround sound systems can deliver once if they're set up correctly and if they're of a good enough quality and you have that great content that's been produced for them.
Have you heard of something called the McGurk effect?
I have. You'll have to remind me.
So it's where you have, it looks at that kind of what you were just talking about there, visual dominance, that idea. Someone moving their lips in two different ways. And if you look at one side of the screen and you focus your attention, you'll hear them saying fa. And if you look at the other side of the screen, you'll hear the audio as being ba with a B, so an F or a B at the front. And I think coming back to your point is that there's something really interesting about maybe why we tend to prioritize vision over sound. And I think that then trickles down into all different aspects of how we, not just movies, but even dining experiences. Because if you think about it, now there are more and more hospitality-based businesses that are starting to think about and I guess even the rise of, let's say, audio branding, right? And having these kind of audio signatures and companies having an audio logo, that's all become pretty popular in the last 20 years or so. But visual logos and visual presentations have always been at the kind of considered more important. And I think in hospitality, up until probably only the last decade or two, the idea of using audio in a kind of meaningful and immersive way has only really kind of, maybe we've seen a few examples as pop-ups. I think there's been a few chefs around the world who, have an interest in sound and audio. You've got quite a few kind of collaborations. So we've worked with Zito, who was a composer based in Singapore, and you've got quite a few other chefs who have worked with sound producers on designing kind of one-off or pop-up events. But I guess part of what got us kind of quite excited about this project was the opportunity to develop something for the chef's table that would allow us to really explore how far we could take that. And rather than just having a kind of, a short run of an event, looking at in the long run, how can audio be used in a kind of interesting, meaningful and enhancing way as part of food and dining experiences. And now that we're kind of on that path, what do you think are some of the value that we can bring to the experience through using audio?
Well, I would say one of the main things you can now deliver with a sort of more sophisticated audio setup is that authenticity, that ability to reproduce sounds in a way that isn't just being dominated from a certain direction, but is actually encompassing you from all directions, as sound does naturally in the real world. Of course, there are times when, for artistic effect, it's useful to, not gimmicks, but to create this kind of sound effects, things flying around the room, perhaps in a way that is not so natural. But you can use those to great effect, of course. But it's actually the sensation of really delivering sounds, immersing you in a way that is essentially natural as we hear things in the real world. Another, actually, from just a purely kind of physical acoustics point of view, big benefit of having speakers all around the users, around the sort of the dining, in this case, the dining table, is you don't have to have one speaker playing very loudly for everyone to hear. All speakers can play at a lower level because you have more speakers closer to every individual. And in a way that brings a lot of benefits, especially in a room where you have, it's a large space, it's fairly reflective, so you have a lot of kind of reverberation going on. And if you have one speaker playing very loudly, it's essentially going to sound terrible for the people quite far away.
Right.
But you have speakers all around people, all of them can play a little bit lower, and every individual is much closer to one speaker that's playing. So what we in the industry say is signal to noise ratio, how much of the signal that the speaker is playing that you want the individual to hear versus all the other stuff you don't want to hear, like all the reflections, so on. It's a much higher ratio. So every individual gets a slightly better experience than they would have with just one. And that brings a lot of benefits also in hospitality, because the number of times and I'm not alone in thinking this, you go to restaurants, for example, and you can barely talk to your neighbor,
Sure.
to your dining partner, because it's just so loud, and it's there's so much reflections bouncing off the walls, and as a result, people then have to shout more and more. You have this kind of loudness war that's quite well known, and it can actually just make the whole experience quite unbearable for many people. And you couple that also with a very clear trend in hearing loss at a younger age, people basically listening to things too loudly, losing their sense of hearing at a bit earlier in age. This all kind of melds together into a melting pot. So having audio systems that you can very nicely balance to the room is a huge benefit, not just in terms of artistic possibilities, but also from kind of a wellness point of view, and just for to create a more sort of pleasant experience for those diners as well.
Yeah, I think audio is, again, looked at as in more of a functional perspective than it is as a immersive experiential element of the experience. And as I said, again, in the last 10, 20 years, you're probably finding more restaurants and more hospitality venues that are starting to really kind of think about how they use audio in an effective way. But you can still rock up to a lot of, restaurants where it's most likely just a kind of standard playlist on a Spotify playlist played over loudspeakers, and no one's really kind of paying too much attention to, the quality of the audio experience that's being delivered. And if you think about it, even just kind of thematically, there's been some really interesting research that I read about in Professor Spencer's gastrophysics book years ago, and it was looking at for example, in a wine aisle, if you have, German Belka music playing versus some form of French music playing, that you'd sell more French or German wines on that aisle. So there's all sorts of kind of interesting correlations, I guess, even in terms of our judgments and expectations that audio can kind of unknowingly influence.
I mean, just purely from a personal point of view, I'm really fascinated by the role that audio can play in sort of altering your mood and your state. So, for example, I was doing my master's degree 2017 to 2019, and during those hectic sort of revision days, but leading up to the exams, where you're just spending all day staring over textbooks, going through equations, and basically revising everything you've been studying. I was doing a lot of study in my sort of communal kitchen in my student dorm. And we had a big TV, and you could AirPlay or whatever, cast something on YouTube. And that was when I found these YouTube playlists where it's 4, 5, 6, 7 hours long, and they're called things like golden oldies, and there's a fireplace crackling in the corner, and there's a thunderstorm outside. Like, that's the name of the YouTube video, right? And it'll just be some random old 40s, 50s tune, typically kind of low pass filtered to make it sound a bit kind of warm and cozy, layered on top with sort of sound effects of a fire crackling or a thunderstorm. And often they'll have babble, muffled people talking to emulate you as a kid being upstairs in your parents' room while your parents are having a cocktail party downstairs. Right. So it's trying to emulate this real sense of nostalgia. And for me, it was extremely powerful. I found it so, just cozy, very sort of beguiling, I guess is the right word. It really found it a nice way to just engage in what I was doing without being distracting. And you could argue that audio you meant to listen to, you meant to sit in the right place and listen to where the sound is produced. But I think there's a huge aspect of audio, real powerful aspect of audio, of just setting the scene. You don't have to be consciously listening to it, but it's there. So maybe, I don't know if it's conscious or subconscious, that's out of my area of expertise, but certainly there is a level of registration that this audio is playing a role in how you're perceiving this moment in time. And also the effects it can have on your memory is also powerful. I mean, everyone knows, you can name points in your life, in your childhood, based on what album you were listening to at that time.
Sure.
Eras are dedicated to certain artists or even songs. So there is a huge, a very powerful element of audio that I think is known, but often still nonetheless overlooked when it comes to how people kind of perceive sound and how they invest their money and that kind of thing into good sound systems. But yeah, I'm personally just I love these things, that how you can set the mood and you can kind of alter your state of mind just by putting on some audio that kind of defines the atmosphere that you're trying to achieve, and it can really help you take you there.
And talking about kind of altering people's moods, you can create tension through sound, right? You can relax and calm people through sound. So, one of the dishes that we have on the menu has a beating heart. And I've had a couple of guests over time kind of say, this is quite intense, and that beating heart. And I believe that faster the heart is beating, that you will in some way feel that tension and anxiety. And I think they use this in movies, and I think they use this very effectively in movies. But again, as part of a dining experience, no one's ever thought about, could I affect the mood of my diners purely through, can I get them feeling all apprehensive and tense and excited in some way at the beginning of the dining experience? Can I ease them into a kind of calm enjoyment at some point? Another good example would be when we worked with Audi, the car company. And one of the courses that we did was based on a viral online ad that they had created, where you had this R8 basically on a treadmill, and it was just kind of revving up. And it was really the audio that was really, really powerful about this video. And so what we did is we would screen the video, and then we'd ask guests to place headphones on, and they would listen to the audio. So it starts off with the kind of engine purring away. It goes into it kind of roaring up in terms of acceleration, and then the engine cooling down as it's braking. And we got them essentially to do a kind of high-end tequila slammer as they were doing this. So they would start by dissolving a sachet on their tongue that contained different types of sugars and salts that had a cooling effect. They would then chase that as the engine was revving with this kind of warm ginger tequila drink that they would sip through this straw, and then they would finish when the engine was cooling with this carbonated, like fizzy piece of lime that they'd bite into. But what was really interesting is the physical effect that the sound had on people in terms of just making you kind of tense up at times, maybe hairs on the kind of back of your neck sticking up. And you can have all these physical reactions in a way, even things like pupil dilation that can be caused as part of the sounds that you're exposed to. And I guess this is a big part of, what interests me in using sound as a meaningful way of exciting people, tapping into their emotions. You can hear a piece of music that makes you feel really melancholy, right? You can hear a piece of music that just, without even having to have much context around it, can just make you self-reflective or make you kind of feel a bit melancholy or down. And then you have other pieces of music, and we all have this, which are, our power music, that stuff that really kind of gets us going and gets us fired up. But it's incredible that music, and not just music, but soundscapes, audio, ticking clock, the quicker it ticks, the more you kind of feel that anxiety, a heartbeat racing, the more tension you feel. And I guess I love that idea that you can alter people's states through what they listen to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in some way it's ubiquitous in the sense that some of these things can be very well generalized to lots of people. So as you said, there are certain songs where you give it to, you play it to most people and they'll feel upbeat, energized, or they'll feel melancholy and somber. But there's also a huge amount of personal variance within that.
Sure.
Some people will click much, much more with a certain song, or maybe one song gets someone really energized, and for someone else they just despise the song or the audio so much that they're just totally turned off. So I think that's really interesting, is finding those broad categories of sound that work in general for many people, but also is there a way to personalize it for different people as well? I mean, that's certainly outside the scope of of what we're doing here, but as just a talking point, I think that's how personal it is very, very interesting. And also what it can help you achieve. I mean, I do a lot of running and cycling as a sort of a strong hobby of mine outside of work, and I often, not always, but often use music.
Oh,
When
100%.
running, especially in those moments where you are just maybe lacking a bit of motivation.
Yeah.
Or actually, like, very usefully is to keep a certain steady cadence as well.
Yes.
So often, if running to music that pumps me up,
Yeah.
I will actually run too fast in the sense that I want to keep a certain pace, and I'm now going faster than I need to. So if you have music that's at a certain BPM, and there are thousands of playlists on all sorts of streaming services that offer this, that can also really just help you keep in rhythm. And I find that sort of connection, this sort of mechanical auditory connection with the body is also quite, I mean, it's tapped into, clearly. It's no secret, but it's very interesting.
That idea of kind of keeping a certain rhythm or tone and using music to kind of energize you. I wouldn't be able to work out without music. I've had those moments of going to the gym and having to double back all the way home to go get my headphones, because there is no way I can work out without having that audio
Yes,
motivator.
certainly in the gym. I don't use the gym very often, to be honest, but I usually do my exercise outside. But yeah, if I was in the gym, 100%, I need to have something outdoors often. But I do also have to sort of wean myself off of it, because sometimes I become too dependent to the point where if I don't have music now, I can't pace myself. So it's a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah.
That's kind of the end point.
And one thing that I find really interesting as well is when it comes to kind of, and you touched on this a little bit in terms of memories and kind of emotion, how we can recall memories, right? Now, our chemical senses are actually really powerful for locking in memories. Like your sense of smell is a great way of kind of, well, they found there's research out there that would suggest that, linking things that you want to remember with scent is a great way for recalling and enhancing your memory. So a good example would be if I was to say, if you just in your mind's eye can see a frying pan with onions frying in it, there's a good chance that in your mind's eye you can kind of visualize that. And then if I was to say, can you hear the sizzle of the onions? There's a good chance that in your mind's eye, you can kind of recreate that. You know what sound I'm talking about if I say the sizzle of the onions. But you can't taste the sizzle of the onions. If I was to say, now try and recreate the smell of it, because your chemical senses just won't do that. And it's interesting, again, to think of just how powerful our sense of hearing is in relation to memory and recalling things. And again, when we think about that, that almost seems like a bit of a kind of missed opportunity, or not missed opportunity, but there's something very powerful about that I don't think. For example, if you're trying to remember something, maybe you'll pull out a photo, a person, you'll remember them by a photo. Rarely do you remember them through maybe an audio note or clip or something like that. And actually that could be a very powerful way maybe of enhancing people's memories around things.
That's actually funny. I mean, I agree. I mean, also when studying, so it's normally written notes. But actually, as you mentioned, I just remembered when I was much younger at school, when I was studying for, I guess, like GCSE, something like that. My dad actually used to, so I would have little, Post-it notes or cards with all my notes on, and my dad would actually record them. So he would read them out, record them, and then before bed, I would listen to them in bed, not whilst falling asleep, because that definitely doesn't work, but before actually falling asleep, listen to them over it. And I would do that every night, actually. And I can't attest to whether that actually led to better results, but I remember that sort of, it did something for sure. I certainly when it comes to memory, there's no doubt that it's an extremely strong cue, right? That can bring back other sensory recollections.
Yeah. So talking about memory, I have quite a personal memory that's related to Bang Olufsen. And it was, I must have been about 13 at the time, and I had just moved to Kuwait, where I was for a few years at school. And they had this brand new shiny mall open up, as they do in these countries. And one of the first stores that I remember going into was a Bang & Olufsen store. And I'd never No, I lie. I had laid eyes on these products before, and the memory goes back even further to maybe when I was about 12, and a friend's, when I went over to his house, his parents had bought a Bang & Olufsen sound system that was essentially flat against the wall, and you'd wave your hand over it and it would part, and you'd put the CD in. Now, this seemed like absolute space age stuff back in, I'm talking about probably 94, 95, something around then. But it wasn't just that kind of idea of the mechanics and how it worked and the aesthetics of how it looked. That was a huge part of it. I mean, I'd never seen such a beautifully designed piece of audio equipment in my life. I'd heard some pretty good sound systems, but never had I seen anything quite like that. And then coupled with the quality of the audio that came out of that was just kind of mind-blowing. And that's how I first became familiar with the brand. And then I, as I said, went into that store in the mall that they'd opened up, and they sat you in a room and you got this full kind of cinematic experience. And it just blew my mind. I'd never been aware that home entertainment systems could look anything like that. And it's interesting because at the time I had just recently moved from, Egypt, which I'd lived for a couple of years, which is a relatively poor country, into a relatively rich country like Kuwait, where you had these kind of stores and you had these kind of audio entertainment systems. And it just blew my mind as a child. And that Bang & Olufsen then forever can remain cemented in my mind as being, this incredible audio brand. And so so for me, I guess part of what's really exciting about the partnership is the fact that we get to now work with Bang & Olufsen, and that we have this as part of the Chef's Table experience. And I came to the Bond Street store, and you gave me that wonderful demonstration of the speakers. And I think for those who are watching, listening, it would be great to just get a bit of an idea on what is an audio company? What does it classify itself as? Does it produce hardware? But then there's a lot of software that goes behind. Like I didn't realize that until we'd had that meeting. And just there's a lot of, not just about the hardware itself, but the software. But there's something about how Bang & Olufsen do what they do that is just magic to me.
Well, I mean, perhaps a nice parallel, we spoke earlier about how, just having lots of good quality speakers all around you isn't the only thing you need. You need also good content that's created. It's the coupling of those two together. And the same way within the sort of the products world of B&O speakers, it's also not just having good quality drivers. Of course, that's a big part of it, but you also need the design, the software behind it. And there is of course always some degree of compromise between all those different groups within the organization. That design would love to do one thing one way, and acoustics would like to do something in a different way to optimize it for their disciplines. But what I think B&O does really, really well, and that speaks for all the products they've launched in the past, which are, I would argue, fairly iconic from both an acoustic quality point of view, but also the design point of view, is that ability to bring those aspects together, creating something that's unique, which sounds fantastic as well. And actually, my boss brought up a quote the other day, I think it's about 2 months ago, which was actually quite interesting when you think about it, which is, if you look at a portfolio of products and you showed them to someone and said, "What is this?" the chance of them saying that it's clearly a loudspeaker is very, very low. So they are very unique, right? They don't look necessarily like a loudspeaker, and that's intentional. They are meant to, be unique, be very design driven, fit into, beautiful homes, or in this case, fantastic dining experiences.
They do look like art pieces.
Yeah, they do, and they're very iconic, but we don't compromise on the sound quality. We have the best acousticians in the world. So if those who don't know, the company is within Denmark. There are 2 offices, one in Struer, which is the headquarters where B&O was founded in, actually 99 years ago. So we're going to be 100 next year. Yeah. And then we also have the sort of near Copenhagen office. And across those two sites, but there are many other sites around the world who also make huge contributions to the products, of course. We have, the acoustics team, we have the DSP, so the digital signal processing team, we have software, we have the app team, we have human interface design. We have people whose job is solely to decide, you as a human, how do you interface with the product? How does the product give you feedback, whether it's visual or haptic and so on? We have the app team who design and implement a lot of those concepts into the app to ensure that as you navigate the products through an app, it's logical, it makes sense, it flows nicely. So we have a lot of different branches in the organization who, of course, work together. But I would say underpinning all of that is this very core value, which is driving both the aesthetics, the design, and the acoustic quality of the products. And I think, in my opinion, it comes through in what we deliver to the market. And maybe I could just say a few words about what we've installed here in Kitchen Theory. It's our portfolio is broadly split. If you look at the loudspeakers, is broadly split into what we call the BioSound, or the flexible products, which are typically more for, in the home, speakers that can be placed in a more sort of flexible manner. You can pick them up, move them around. And then we have the BioLab series, which is sort of a much more high-end, more acoustically quality-driven side of things as well. Typically used for what we call staged setups, where things are fixed, they don't move around. So what we've actually installed here is the BioSound Theatre, which is basically our latest soundbar, which also supports the sort of Dolby Atmos decoding, which I think we'll discuss later on. But you can kind of think of that as the brain of everything. It gets audio, you configure it through the app, and it does all the hard work. It distributes the audio, so you've got input, brain, and then it distributes that audio to all the speakers that you have connected to it. And in this case, we have 8 BioLab 8 speakers placed around the dining table. And I think the final sort of comment I would make on the B&O speaker side of things is another sort of core component of our products is intentionally to include fantastic technology. So technology that really brings value to the user. So as an example, you have a microphone that comes with the with the BioSound Theatre. You put it down, you run one measurement, and your whole system is now calibrated. So you, as a consumer, you have lots of speakers in different positions, and of course they won't be in the correct place because you have to fit it within your own sort of personal space. They'll need to be calibrated. So the speakers which are too close need to be, made a little bit quieter and delayed a little bit. And you do that once with our microphone, and the system does everything for you. So it's a way of combining lots of fantastic, useful technology, but also abstracting it from the user.
Yeah.
You don't need to know what it's doing under the hood. You don't need to press lots and lots of different buttons. So I think that's the one thing that's really nicely packaged into our products, is that ability to deliver amazing technology, amazing audio and acoustic quality, with an iconic kind of design-led approach.
And you mentioned Dolby Atmos, which
Yeah.
I had heard of, but ever since having worked with yourself and Oliver on, understanding how this setup was going to work at Kitchen Theory, I've had to get my head kind of around exactly how that works. So tell us a little bit about Dolby Atmos as a technology.
I would first say it's just very misunderstood, and it's really no different to stereo or mono in many ways. It's also very different, and it's actually much easier to understand if you start with the basics. So start with mono. Mono means you have one channel of audio, and you send that to a user. So you send it to a loudspeaker, and that loudspeaker should play back that one channel of audio. If you then move to stereo, you now have 2 channels of audio, and they both need to be reproduced. And you can reproduce them either through 2 dedicated loudspeakers, but there are also many products on the market today which will take 2 inputs and play them both back through a single product. The question is, well, how do you now get many more channels of audio to the user? What if you want to do 12 or 14, or I mentioned earlier this 22.2 system from NHK in Japan. That's 24 channels of audio. How do you get them to the user? And essentially, in a nutshell, Dolby Atmos is a way to package many channels of audio into a format that can be quite easily transported to the end user, and then what we call decoding, kind of extracting it out, and then you have access to those channels. And then, of course, what you do with those channels.
And what does that mean in a practical sense?
In a practical sense, it means you can now deliver much more potential to the end product. So if you think about audio channels, mono, stereo, 5.1, and so on, if you just think about them as potential, right? They comprise lots of audio across a number of channels. And in an ideal world, you would have speakers that can reproduce all of those input channels. And a prerequisite to reproducing them is getting them to the products in the first place. So it's a transportation tool, essentially, a format for transporting more than 2 channels of audio to the user. So there are many. Dolby Atmos is, of course, not the only one. There are also fixed formats like MPEG-H, which was co-developed by Fraunhofer in Germany, that essentially do the same thing. But Dolby Atmos today is quite dominant in the industry because they've really executed their plan well in getting the Atmos format used, not just in the film world for delivering multi-channel film content, but also delivering multi-channel music as well through services like Apple Music, for example. So in a nutshell, all it is just a different way to transport many more channels, many more than 2 channels of audio to the user. There are some more sophisticated things it can do, like it can transport what we call object-based audio, which is slightly different to channel-based audio in the sense that it preserves the original audio signals, but without mixing them into a channel-based layout. So to give you a concrete example, you might use objects if you're distributing, say, a sports match, and you want the user. You don't know what the user's language is. Maybe they speak French, maybe they speak English, maybe they speak German.
Sure.
What you can do is you can transport the audience or the crowd as a channel mix, stereo, for example, 5.1. But then you transport 3 different commentators, one in English, one in French, one in German, as objects. And then what you can do on the user side, it enables what we call sort of interactivity or personalization. The user can just, with their remote control, choose which commentary they want with the flick of a switch, because all of that information is actually there as an object. So that's just one example of how object-based audio can be applied for the consumer. And Dolby Atmos is one example of a format that does also support object-based audio.
What would you say, because when we were talking about Bang Olufsen's technologies, one thing I kind of understood from the demo that we did is there's a lot of innovation that goes into the technologies to create these speakers. But what about the actual content? Because we've touched on this. What kind of content do we need to be creating to really take advantage of these setups and these speakers and this hardware and the software that's driving it?
Well, the main thing that has now been enabled is a sort of a wide distribution of loudspeakers around an area. So you now have the freedom to place sounds at different moments in time in different spaces. In this case, in the dining room. And I think there are a plethora of opportunities that enables, but just as a few examples, one is you can now create much more authentic soundscapes. And we touched on that earlier in the conversation, is that because you now have speakers from multiple different directions from the user perspective, your ability to reproduce a more sort of authentic, faithful reproduction of a soundscape as you would hear it in the real world is greater. But then there's also opportunities in terms of creating very interesting, like non-linear storytelling. So for example, people along one side of the table who are closer to a certain set of the speakers in the room, they can be exposed to certain sounds while people on the other side are not. So they hear something which people across the table don't hear from them. But then maybe 10 seconds later, the people across the table then get a similar or slightly different experience. So you can basically create this very complicated sort of storytelling narrative where different people receive different experiences at different times. And that could create a very interesting interactive sort of experience for diners who, they're eating something and maybe you're trying to imbue this sense of disgust, while on the other side, you're trying to do the opposite of create this sense of pleasure. And having that sort of visual interaction, which has been fueled by the audio experience is something that you could now deliver simply because you have enough speakers distributed around the whole dining table, and each speaker can basically act independently.
And that really opens up a lot of interesting opportunities for research as well, in the kind of from a sensory perspective, especially when looking at people's kind of expectations, judgments, satiety, enjoyment around a meal. If you can kind of modulate what different groups at the table are hearing, and you think that gives you a great opportunity to then explore how that audio component can result in delivering an augmented or different experience for one diner based on what they're listening to versus another. And I think that's really interesting. And I guess this comes back to this idea of sound being a bit of a forgotten flavor sense, right? And looking at, what could we learn about the audio component that we could then use to design more interesting, immersive, more pleasurable dining experiences.
I work also at B&O. We have a dedicated perception team. So that group's function is to run controlled scientific listening tests where you expose them to certain, for example, products or algorithms that we're developing, typically in a blind way, and you try to measure their response to certain attributes, like how externalized is that sound, or how well can you localize sounds for this product versus this product, and so on. So I'm personally very, very interested in sort of measuring perception from a purely auditory point of view. And if you then add in multisensory, so what happens when you do this and this and this whilst eating this, for example, for me, it's pretty fascinating. And I have no doubt there will be 1,000 different research projects we could run. And it would be very interesting also to see, a lot of this content creation side of things can be, of course, very intuitively driven. Like, I think if I play this soundscape and I have sounds bouncing around, that would be cool, or that would be interesting, that'd be unique. But actually what would be very interesting in addition to that, because of artistic intuition, of course, is very powerful, but also in parallel running sort of scientific control tests to see, okay, what stuff is really working? Can we measure this? Can we, actually measure people's perception of certain sensory attributes, whether they're purely auditory or also their sense of taste or smell, that kind of thing? Can we measure those and actually sort of prove that some of this stuff really works on average for populations of people? I find pretty fascinating. If we could also work on that.
Well, and I think this is where Professor Spence comes into the mix to give us that kind of academic guidance in terms of how we can capture this information at the table, and how we can design studies that will allow us to better start to kind of understand that relationship and the impact that audio experience can have. Because you see, I guess I'm interested in, beyond that as well, the kind of, you think at schools, care homes, hospitals, is there opportunity to, I'll give you the best example I can think of that really brought this to my attention was when we were doing research in a school with children looking at their sensory relationship with food. By coincidence, we were there one day around the time when they were having their main lunchtime in the school hall. And it turns out that a lot of schools, in the UK at least, will use their kind of, the hall tends to be quite a big, high-ceilinged space, really, really noisy, really, really loud, very kind of big cacophony of noise in this space with all these children there and that din of the dining room. And you just think, this is such an kind of erratic, overstimulated environment, and a big part of that is the sound of the space. There's also the smells and stuff like that I can't say smell too good of a school dinner, but it was really kind of the audio component was, for me, a very disruptive part of that experience. And I guess being a chef and working in fine dining, wanting everything to be, quite controlled and calm, and you just think, gosh, this is the opposite, isn't it? And you think, again, that idea in schools, care homes, hospitals, is there an opportunity to use sound in a more effective way to create better environments? And especially, I'm looking at this from the perspective of food. And, where there's kind of more of a commerciality, you'll find in terms of, or a commercial element to this, let's say in airlines, you've got airlines that have experimented in business class, at least with like noise cancelling headphones and stuff like that. We know that there's definitely that kind of relationship, but I wonder what the opportunities are to use audio in a more kind of meaningful way as part of food experiences.
Well, I mean, firstly, of course, you're absolutely right. It often is overwhelming for many people, not just schools, but that's clearly one place. But I know in Denmark, for example, there are actually regulations around the acoustic properties of schoolrooms. They must adhere to certain, for example, metrics like reverberation time. It should not be too reverberant, and you must, build and design your classrooms adhering to those specifications. But of course, once you leave certain areas outside of the school world, if you're designing a new restaurant or a cocktail bar, you can essentially do what you want. And often people do actually design it in a way to create cacophony, because that's often enticing. As a customer, as you come in, it's all buzzing and energetic. You think, oh, this is a cool place to be. But actually, when you sit there for 5 minutes, oh God, I'm exhausted. So firstly, yes, it can often be an exhausting world, in a world that is already exhausting in so many other ways. And I think there is a huge amount of room to actually alleviate everyday stresses by having better acoustic treatment and acoustic design of environments that we happen to be in, often more urban environments these days. And in terms of what opportunities could arise in the context of, say, this partnership as well, I think often we talk about sound. That's a very abstract word. What does it actually mean, right? Typically, in my opinion, what your people are referring to as sound is what we perceive when sound waves impinge on our ears and eventually become, neural signals, which we then register as some percepts of sound. And as a result, that sound is actually a huge mixture of many different aspects. Firstly, it's the content, we discussed that. Partly, it's the technology that reproduces the sound, but a big component is then also the room, the environment in which that technology sits, because that will alter eventually what reaches your ears. So if there's a lot of reflections and so on, if there's a lot of background noise as well from other elements in the environment, whether it's a noisy neighbor or air conditioning units, that kind of thing. All of this contributes to ultimately what you as a human perceive as sound or auditory perception. So having control over as many of those factors as possible brings you as a curator of experiences many more options to tailor what people actually experience acoustically.
Well, it's interesting to see that audio, again, I know from Professor Spencer's gastrophysics book, where he talks about, and I think it's gastrophysics, or it may be The Perfect Meal, where he talks about there's this kind of rise in hospitality over the last maybe 20, 30 years of restaurants with really loud, kind of almost like nightclubby kind of music. And they're really popular, and many of them around the world. And that the music is played at kind of 70 plus decibels, which research has actually proven reduces perceptually your ability to perceive sweetness and saltiness.
Okay.
And that this is a phenomenon that you even have on airplanes. And that's partially the altitude, partially the kind of cabin pressure and environment that you're in, the drier air, but also they found that the sound of the engines and the noise, the pollution within the cabin, all of that reduces your ability to perceive sweetness and saltiness. So in a sense, again, even physiologically, sound can augment how it is that you perceive taste and flavor. So again, I think just being more mindful of these kind of things it can allow us to design more enhanced food experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would imagine essentially it's just sensory overload. Your brain can only process so many signals at once. And if a huge amount of those signals are being, conjured up by excessive noise in the background, which also may be distracting you, tricking your brain into believing there is danger nearby. If there's constant, transient, like a siren bursting every 5 seconds, of course you're going to be distracted, and that's going to affect your ability to focus on or even enjoy some other sensory experience that you might be having at the same time. So essentially, yes, having that control just opens up so many more opportunities and can really help tailor the experience for the end user.
So for people watching, listening, who have gotten really excited about sound now and want to go to the B&O store and Bond Street, what is it that they need to kind of keep in mind and think about when investing in, buying a really good audio system? What is it that they need to, what are the questions that they need to ask? What is it, the considerations? Because as you were talking about, it really did make me think you're right, because when you're selling someone any sound system, you have no idea what their room setup is like at home. So they need to go, I guess, with a bit of an idea on what it is that they want. So what are the key things that one needs to think about when you walk into that B&O store and you think, right, I want an incredible, acoustic experience in my home? What do they need to be thinking about?
Don't be fooled by loudness. A louder product is not a better product. Okay. So if someone shows you something and it's louder than another thing, you will probably prefer the one that's louder. That doesn't mean it's a better product. So just keep that. That would be my number one rule that I always tell my friends and family when looking for audio products. But somewhat the joke aside, I think you have to first be honest about in what way do you expect to consume audio? Be honest and realistic. Am I going to just be in my bedroom with a speaker in the corner playing a bit of background music while I study or while I read, for example? And of course, there are products that would perfectly cater to such situations. Or are you actually looking for a much more an experience that can actually deliver what we call artistic intent? So someone has produced audio, whether it's in stereo, whether it's in 5.1, so on. There is some degree of artistic intent. This is how someone wants you to hear it. And do you want to try to reproduce that with fidelity? So if the answer is yes, then you're looking really at least a stereo setup. And of course, if you have the space and so on, a surround setup may also be beneficial if you typically listen to content that is available also in surround. So for example, in Dolby Atmos would be one example. And another thing to keep in mind is that many of our products can also be what we call stereo pair them. So you could buy, for example, one product. Just one example would be the Beosound A5. That's a fairly recent product from last year. You could buy one today, and in the future, if you buy another one, you can now simply stereo pair them, so wirelessly stereo pair them. And now you have a fully fledged stereo system. Same applies to the BLR8s that we have installed out there as well. They can be hooked up in stereo or in a more expansive surround sound setup. So yeah, I think my advice is simply be honest. How do you intend, and perhaps keep in mind in the future, how do you think your audio consumption habits might change going into time, and ensure that you choose speakers that will match your lifestyle, essentially. That would be my main advice.
Wonderful. Oliver, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a pleasure learning really a lot more about audio from you over the last few months, and I think we've got some exciting projects in terms of now putting 3D sound into our experience that'll really kind of allow our guests to be taken on this kind of immersive dining experience in a way that they never have before. And thank you so much for your help with this.
Pleasure. Looking forward.
Thank you.